Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on how to build a culture of accountability on your teams. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Harness. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which the panelists and I will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Effective Teams channel. But we'll also leave time to answer your questions live at the end. So please submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom, which is bottom of the screen. And we'll get to those at the end. I'm going to start us off with some introductions. I'm Sarah Milstein. I'll be your moderator today. I'm currently an executive coach for emerging and established leaders in tech. Previously, I was on leadership teams at organizations including Daily, ConvertKit, MailChimp, and 18F. I'm joined today by three terrific panelists. Starting off, I'm going to go from my left to right, starting with Abby Bangser. Abby is principal engineer at Syntasso, a seed stage startup. She's also a team topologies advocate and a cloud native computing foundation ambassador. Leslie Cordero is currently a staff engineer at the New York Times. She was previously at Teachers Pay Teachers and Google, among other orgs. And Nick Smith is currently VP of Engineering at Harness, our sponsor. He was previously at Puppet and Velo, among other orgs. So let's dive in. We wanted to start by defining our terms, and I'm going to give a very brief intro and then turn it over to the panel. So accountability is simply the idea that somebody takes responsibility for how things turn out. That sometimes means that leaders ask individuals to explain what happened when something went wrong, or team members ask each other. But it can also mean that leaders themselves do the work of identifying problems they've created and actively look for ways to avoid making the same mistakes again. Today, we'll talk about all of these aspects, accountability from and to leadership, staff, and peers, and we'll also try to cover how it might look different at companies of different sizes and stages. All right, so Nick, let's start with you. I'd love to hear from your perspective, what is accountability and why is it important?
For me, accountability is ownership. It's with accountability, we know who owns what. We stop tripping over each other. We remove the confusion that we see with inter-team interaction. We uh, we give a clear focus, and teams know what their goals and expectations are. But that accountability lives in a culture where, there's trust, there's transparency, there's retrospective, there's a place where accountability can function. And with accountability comes, I know what I'm accountable for. I know I can tie it to what a customer wants. I know I can tie it to what the company goals are and so on. So accountability is very much, I know what it is the company want from me. I know what what as a team, what's wanted of me. And, I'm set up for success, hopefully by the company to actually drive sort of an autonomous drive towards delivering on that accountability that's been given to me. I think that's in short what I would say.
Yeah, part of what I like about the way that you just define that is it's really looking at a culture of high performance where the teams are really working. And so ownership is really important. One of the things that we talked about when we did our prep is that a good way to understand what accountability is to take a look at what it's not. What happens when it goes wrong? What's the anti-pattern? And I'd love to hear just briefly from each of you a time when you've seen it go wrong, um, and the context for that. What size was the company? Um, Abby, could I ask you to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the things that Nick was saying that I'm just going to call out in more detail is that the ability to make the right decisions because you understand the context of what's around you. There is a great talk I saw at one point at a conference a few years back where it was how the team is successful when they can, given the same context, understand the same trade-offs and come to similar conclusions. And you're always going to have differences of opinions. That's always how you get better outcomes. That is where you get that diversity of thought. But I think it's that idea that having that context in hand and be able to understand the trade-offs and understand how they would impact your team. And so I think where I've been in trouble before when I'm accountable for things is when I am making decisions based on the visibility I have and I'm not given the opportunity to understand the other scope. And sometimes that's for legal reasons, right? So sometimes there's personnel challenges. Someone's going through In the UK, we call that a PIP if you're on a performance enhancement plan, and someone's going through that, and that's not something you can share with everyone on the team. And so sometimes you feel a little bit in the dark, and that's where I think accountability is tough and sometimes needs to be managed maybe above the level it's being handed out to if you don't have the context to make the right decisions.
Yeah, that's great. I love that definition too, that you would all reach the same conclusions, and there are things that could be in your way. Leslie, what's your favorite anti-pattern?
Um, yeah, I think it's a little bit related to what Abby said. So, around sort of ambiguity. Like I think ambiguity is often a driver of, conflict and just not being aligned on either, values or the actual work. So I think that's one of the things I think about a lot. Like access to information is really important, and that access to information also doesn't necessarily isn't distributed equally, right? Like one thing, for example, I've seen a lot in my career is the sort of like unwritten social contract, right? Like the people who are most likely to both influence and understand it are people with less power. And so I think like those are some of the things that are on my mind a lot with respect to like improving organizations. Like, and a lot of that is about having transparency. And sometimes, there are sensitive topics. And it's hard to navigate them. I think, especially when I was a manager in a previous role, it was particularly difficult. As an IC, there's a little bit more, sort of room for having difficult conversations. But, as a manager, it is really, really tough. It's like, I think it was the toughest tension I've ever had to deal with. And actually, kind of based off of a talk that I saw by Sarah, your harassers are nice to me talk. One thing that really spoke to me was like the point about plausible deniability. And I think that's like a huge anti-pattern that especially leadership tends to use, because accountability is scary. Like it is scary to feel like something's your fault, especially when you feel like it isn't because you inherited like a terrible, culture and whatnot. So those are some of the things on my mind.
Leslie, can you elaborate a little bit on what the difference would be between something being your fault and something being your responsibility?
Yeah, that's a phrase that I think about a lot. Actually, like that, I think one of the hard tensions of life, and I think this is applicable to leadership, but also just as people in general, right, is like we all inherited problems that are not our fault, right? I think this is especially like true with when we're talking about like privilege and whatnot, right? Like, men, white people, whatever. They didn't create this world directly, right? Like I have light skin, right? I didn't create colorism, right? But it's still, and it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility to like push back on that privilege, to like, be in solidarity with those other people. And so that's sort of what I'm referring to. Does that clarify enough?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I think some more detail on that might come out later as well. Um, Nick, did you want to add into the point about like what does it look like when things go wrong?
Yeah, I'd lead with the sort of same themes that I've just heard, but I'll go to a sort of very individual sort of example. One where the team have a delivery, they're accountable for a delivery. It's a Friday, and they realize there's a problem on the Wednesday that could have been realized about 4 or 5 weeks earlier. And the reason it wasn't realized was just the engineer involved was afraid to call out, I'm afraid to say, could I have a problem here? And they dug deeper, and they rescinded, they've moved backwards all the time, just trying to fix it, trying to solve it. And fear grew and fear grew with inside the person that, we got stuck with it 2 days before a deployment. Team had to come in over a weekend to get the fix because we had to get it out for a customer, but so much could have been resolved if we had that sort of environment where this person could actually open up. And it's a common thing I see with engineering. And the big thing for me was to actually get into a place that we had a really sort of a retrospective that really worked, that the person had a chance, and everybody had a chance in a safe place to really open up and say, look, how do we get better? even from that example, we had to turn it around to retrospect and say, look at what do we do different next time? And yes, it was very much about the weekly retrospect. But when it goes wrong for me, accountability becomes a finger pointing like it just heard. And it becomes, I'm afraid of my job. I'm afraid if I show a weakness, I may be gone, and so it goes back to accountability needs that culture where it's open, it's trustworthy, you're in there as a team, you're in there as a common delivery. And just a similar scenario.
Yeah, Nick, that's a terrific example. We've all seen some version of that. Um, and I think one of the things that you highlighted in there that's so important is that accountability isn't just saying, like, my bad, this thing happened, but being able to say, how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we not make the same mistakes? And that's a multi-layered question that has to come not just from an individual, but from the team and from leadership, creating an environment where both people can have that discussion and the answers might land, that you could make changes, systemic changes if needed. Leslie.
Actually, that was by accident, sorry.
No worries. All right. So I think, one of the things that's coming up here pretty organically is a question about how does accountability look different um, for execs and for frontline staff? Abby, can you start us off on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, on this, we often think about it from a scope perspective. Of course, an exec is going to have accountability that is going to be far reaching. It's going to be deep. It's probably going to be quite long lasting as well. Whereas in IC, I mean, especially if we're talking about kind of a mid-level engineer or something to that effect, is going to have a more short time frame, a more kind of a contained, accountable piece of work. But I think that more important than the scope of the work is, to me, is about the feedback loops. I think that when you are an individual contributor, you often are getting kind of explicit feedback from people who are above you in the hierarchy, maybe peers to you in the hierarchy and above, envision sort of above you. If you're in the exec, you may not have clarity on who's above, and the people who you are fighting. So if you're only have the board above you, your reports may not see their feedback to you, right? So I think one of the big things is about generating feedback, regardless of if you're an exec. Oh, am I going in and out? I apologize. I just want to, I'll go quick and say, I think it's about generating feedback loops and making sure that if you're at the exec level, that you are displaying vulnerability and transparency with the work that you're doing, and making sure that you are actively looking for the feedback on how this is working, how the decisions you're making are affecting things, because it may not be as natural for that to come to you as it would be if you're in IC, where you have managers who that's their entire job is to go and find ways to provide you that feedback. So
Yeah, that's an excellent call out about some of the perils of that role and the importance of modeling. Leslie.
Yeah, so I've been a manager, though I wasn't in an executive position, but I was still a manager, and then now, I'm a staff engineer, so I've sort of seen both flavors of the IC versus management role. And I think as ICs, one, it depends on level, right? Like just like Abby said, there's a difference between like an entry level or mid level and a staff or principal. So it's been, and I think that scope part, right? Like to a certain extent, that also extends to ICs as well. Like my mistakes, they do have more impact than a mid-level engineers. I do have the privilege to like set culture more than than a younger engineer. And so that's, I think that's the similarity between the roles, is that your scope does increase that, or like your scope, or rather your flaws kind of scale with your like position of privilege. So that's one thing that I think that is shared amongst the two. I think where it's differentiated is like your accountability to like execute. It's like C-suite, for example. I think like for ICs and whatnot, it's hard to see that sort of behind the scenes tensions that they're dealing with. And so it's easy to and And on both sides, right, it's easy to kind of dismiss the issues of the other. And I think with accountability, like the thing that why it's so scary to leaders is because it sort of flips the script, right? Like it's very easy for them to hold ICs accountable, but the opposite, right, is hard. And being open to being accountable, it requires a level of like vulnerability. And vulnerability is hard, especially when you're not used to having to do it. So I think like that's a lot of like why the tension I think of when leaders are having trouble with like getting over the like whether it's your fault versus whether it's your responsibility, is because it is scary, right? Like no matter we all have, family to take care of, ourselves to take care of, etc. And feeling like your job is at risk, it's like, just really scary and it's valid, but right, we have to hold that intention with doing right by other people. Like we shouldn't try to achieve excellence and success by sacrificing other people. And I think that's something that's often lost on folks. And a lot of that is because like leadership or management is not talking to ICs a lot. And I'm feeling this especially because, so I work at the Times and we're in the middle of bargaining for a first contract as a union. And so that's been a very different experience than what I'm used to in tech for sure, where, unions aren't much of a thing. And so it's been interesting to see that sort of difference in how we think about accountability, because a lot of it is now about like, how do we, in solidarity with one another, make sure that management is being held accountable, that we're being held accountable fairly with like just cause, et cetera. So before it's more like organic or more grassroots. And I mean, this is grassroots as well, but it is more formalized. But I think, some of the consequences of that is now we don't speak to each other as much. Like that relationship is a lot more tense. I don't know what it's going to look like post, contract, but it is definitely a weird shift that I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like and how it looks like in an effective way. Because I think right now it's, especially with what's going on in tech in general, it's been a tough one to navigate.
There is a whole nother panel to be had about unions in tech and how those can evolve over time. But I appreciate you raising that. And I think one of the things that's also embedded in what you were talking about is some assumptions about size. When you get, there is some tip over point at which staff and leadership see things differently and have pretty significantly different information. And there's some tension in how, in those roles. But in smaller startups, often that gap is quite narrow. And so accountability and how we think about building trust and holding each other accountable looks a little bit different in smaller organizations. Just wanted to create room if anybody wanted to speak to that directly right now. I think it might also come up later as well. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, look, just to close that last one as well. I've seen where, because I sat in exec for 3 years in Puppet, and I've seen it go horribly wrong, where a blame game, not necessarily in that company, but where that sort of blame game from the top happened, and we've seen an exit of 20% of the engineering staff because that quickly you could actually, when things were good, that quickly you could actually have that impact as a leader. But I think whatever size you're looking at, it's the same mindset. If you're an exec, you're going to foster this. If you really want to drive accountability, you're going to foster how you're going to lead. And so if it's a big organization, you'll do things like for RCAs where customers have had issues. You'll do group RCAs with multiple teams coming together so they learn from each other on where things have gone wrong. So you're driving that retrospect right from the top down, and it should come across as normal. I think with the smaller, yeah, you probably hit on this later on, but with the smaller teams, I think it's the same sort of mindset, but things are probably moving slightly faster. But you're the same mindset, and you've got to show how you want to lead. If you're sitting exactly, you got to show that you're open for things can fail, and you're not going to go and point blame, that the goal is how do we learn from this? What do we do differently next time? The sooner we know that we're failing, that the better it is. And I think that's coming from that sort of executive position. It's not good enough to say just I'm gonna show that I care. It's no, you need to act. And things can happen at scale where, as I say, you set up groups that show that retrospective is strong, that show that you learn from mistakes and the company moves on. And there really isn't an excuse for a leader not to drive that. And it's what I was pointing at as the anti-pattern. When things go wrong and the blame game comes out, then you lose people. You lose your best people. So,
Yeah, excellent. So that's a perfect setup for our next question, which is, what are some of the ways that you've seen accountability woven into company culture? Leslie, can you kick us off?
Yeah, I think it ties back to what I was saying a little bit earlier. Like unionization is one way that to make that happen. I think that's a big part of why, unions exist, is because it does sort of force it to be into the culture. Now, maybe that's not the question, is like, that's more of an answer for like, how do you change it? But in terms of so I guess when you're starting out small, I think it's like particularly important that like you have a strong leadership team that prioritizes this, because that foundation needs to be built with, good values and good intentions, and good impact. So I think it is something that you have to think about very intentionally from the beginning, because otherwise, you let these problems slide, they become chronic problems, and then those are far harder to like solve, right? It's usually when those chronic problems emerge and they become too overwhelming that things like union become necessary, right? It would be great if we lived in a world where we don't need unions, but we're not there yet, right? So I think like that sort of foundation and having the strong leadership team is like super important. And they should have a good culture within that circle too, right? Like there's the whole entire companies, but then there's also the subgroups that of course make that company. And the core leadership team, I think, having psychological safety, having transparency, having vulnerability, it becomes even more important because, again, like I think I said earlier, the level of scale that your decisions make is naturally larger. So yeah, those are some thoughts on my mind.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love some specific examples of when each of you has seen accountability effectively woven into culture. And I think Leslie has set up some good framework and patterns to look for. But I'd love some specific examples, some stories perhaps, or just a little vignette of a time you saw it work well. Abby.
I think it's just a really concrete thing, which maybe feels really small, but is starting to become more popular these days, is ownership of the software you're writing from end to end. So being involved, everything from designing a solution through to customer support. We talk about wearing the pager. I think that at a team level, having that sort of ownership, I've noticed a change in behavior in engineers when they're like, wait, I could get woken up if I push this code today and I go home for the day. It's not that they're scared to push the code, but they're thoughtful about, did I write that test? Do I want to push it at 5 p.m. or wait until the next morning, based on their ability to support it that evening, right? They're taking responsibility for that. It's not that they're scared to do it. And so I think a really concrete way to build accountability is to create, again, not to repeat myself, but that's those feedback loops. And sometimes that's about the feedback from the decisions you made, making sure that those come back to you. And I think from an IC level, from a software delivery level, that's giving people access to customer experiences and production experiences.
Yeah, that's great. And I think what's particularly important to note there is accountability comes from customers as well. And ideally, like very much from customers. That's part of what we should be most concerned about, not just how our teammates are responding, but how our customers are experiencing the results of our work. Nick, do you have an example you want to add here?
I think, I'll be spot on with what you said. And I think, the pattern that you see, the change in culture, I can see at the minute is that it's the norm. No, it's not, oh God, I got woken up. It's like this complete norm that I expect to be called out if I don't take care of testing, if I don't take care of scale, if I don't take care of making sure the customer gets what they want. And that's the mindset. It's like sitting from the top and going, I can see a product releasing and lots of positive customer feedback coming back without much interaction from outside the team, that they've just gone and done that. And that to me drives that whole team autonomy, and that is working. And these are signals that you're really looking for. And you know what? You haven't been involved as much as you needed to because it's become a norm. And that's where you're trying to drive towards, that sort of a team autonomy and not owning, like Abby says, software right from the start. They need to be in at the start to really be involved in the design stage right up to the end when there's an issue with a customer. And it's great to see how things are evolving, but you can also see how you move much faster when it is like that. So I guess I'm reiterating more of what Abby said there, but yes, that's the thoughts I have.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting that this is sort of a bigger cultural shift in software. It's a little bit of a pendulum swing on this, who's on the page or the other end of the pager. But I think it's also a real opportunity because it's something like teams should be asking, of course, when you're building something, who's going to be responsible when there's an incident, who's going to be responsible when the pager goes off. But it's also a question that execs can ask. Should be asking how are you all answering this question? Let's make sure that we're asking the right questions about ownership through from design through testing through production launch, whatever stages you have. That not that the execs need to answer those questions, but they should be making sure they're getting answered being asked by the teams. Leslie.
Yeah, one thing that spoke to me when Nick was speaking is about the idea of it being normal. When I was thinking about this question at first, to be honest, my first instinct was like, have I ever seen it done well? Right. And but I think where that's coming from is like you remember the bad experiences, right, more than the positive ones, right? And I think part of that's because, oh, it's just part of normal, so it doesn't stand out in my mind, right? But if I think more deeply, it's like, oh, this is an example, like that's an example. So I think it being part of the norm is definitely a super important part. Because otherwise you don't even have to think about it, right? Like there's just an assumption that there's going to be accountability. And I think, for all the talk about psychological safety, right? I think that often comes to people as like there can't be accountability with that because then it turns into a blame game and that feels like psychologically unsafe. But really to me, it's more about like making sure that you're preserving safety regardless of whatever happens, because we're people, so mistakes are going to happen. There's not going to be any organization that's ridden of flaws, right? Every company is just its own unique flavor of, flaws and oh yeah. And so I always think about when I'm finding a new job, like what version of like, bad flaws do I want to like intake, right? It's not about like finding a perfect company. It's like finding like, okay, which are the ones that you're willing to, negotiate to work on. So yeah, and I think a more specific example, I think for myself, is so I guess within the so I think for me it's been when I've managed like a team. I think I'm struggling to see whether this is like a positive one or actually, but sometimes it comes at a lot of sacrifice. I think what it works is essentially admitting fault is like the first step to me. Like where did you go wrong? Why did you go wrong? Like what's the context behind that? And then like as part of that is centering the people who were impacted. And I think that one can be a little tricky because it can sometimes come across as like, okay, I see. Can you solve this problem that I am obviously very responsible for? Which is not unfair because it's probably not in their job description and it's, deflecting responsibility. But I think what you can do is do things like think about it yourself, like show that you put a lot of thought into this, that it is something that you actually care about, that it was genuinely a mistake, not intentional, right? Because I know we say a lot about assume good intent, right? When you're in an environment that lacks trust, it's hard to have that assumption. And so I think that those are the ways you can kind of build that trust. So that way accountability is just part of the culture so much so that you don't have to think about it. I think with teams that I've been on, that's been one of the nice attributes. It's when I can just trust that like X happened and my manager or whomever is going to take care of it in all the ways that they have access to. So those are some of the thoughts. It gets a little bit more complicated when it becomes more serious. Like I think the examples we heard so far are more about like shipping code and whatnot. It becomes a lot more complicated when it gets into more people and like interpersonal issues, especially when things like harassment are part of the problem that you're dealing with. Especially because that also means like sensitivity is a bit like there almost needs to be a lack of transparency behind those situations, but it's hard to trust like then are they being handled correctly? And I think for leaders, like one talk that is like on the back of my mind sort of brewing is like, so, you know, I come from I'm a site reliability engineer. And so we talk about a lot of like postmortems and whatnot and blameless postmortem culture and these things. And I wish something that people would do, leaders would do more that I've done in the past and has been really helpful. It's like postmortem something bad that happened like culturally, you know, did you have, if someone spoke out about harassment and that became a huge topic of conversation, like have a postmortem with your other leaders and ask like, shoot, like one, how do we get here? Like, how do we solve this, right? And then sharing that out with the people who you lead tends to actually build that trust back. And so those are some of, I think, the things that I've seen be really effective.
Yeah, I think that last point is what I was referring to earlier, that just saying my bad isn't enough. Being able to say, here's what we've learned and here's what we're going to try to do differently in the future. That's what builds trust and accountability and models it as well. Leslie, something you just mentioned that we haven't dived into, but I think is important, is some years ago, a norm among software companies was the idea of the blameless postmortem. Um, and I think we've started to move away from that. Well, sort of culturally, there's been a little bit of a shift because I think it started to feel like what that really meant was no one's ever accountable for anything. And I do wonder, how can we have retros and postmortems that strike a balance, that let people take some responsibility without it just being, that was my fault, so I'll act differently next time? Because that's rarely the answer to avoiding the mistakes. And the problem is like one person's going to behave differently. Usually you need to look at something more systemic. And I wonder if you all are seeing a change in how people are understanding and analyzing problems at your companies now. Or is everybody still in the blameless postmortem, which is cool if true? Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think I can see where I've seen it drift without even noticing this happened until you said. But the I think it comes with autonomous teams. It comes with, if you really want to make a team autonomous and they drive things on their own, they learn how to retrospect the best. You know, they learn that yes, there's no point in sort of tiptoeing around things either, but they learn that the biggest impact on changing how we do things is actually working out where it's gone wrong, maybe who's done something wrong. But I feel that the team themselves, if you really give them the autonomy to actually set them up, we're talking about accountability. They know accountability is sitting there. They know they have to deliver something. So if they don't tune their retrospective to actually get better time on week on week, they're going to lose. You know, and I think it's just a natural thing that they don't. I don't think they think of titles and whether it's blameless or not. They think of, right, what's the best way that we can get the feedback to move quicker. But obviously we talked about culture. It's a strong culture. You need for that sort of that conversation to happen. But for me, it goes to autonomous teams. You really are taking on accountability with the team, and the team really owns it. Then retrospective becomes a tool that they're going to use, and they're going to use it the best way they can to get to where they need to be.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that, Leslie.
Yeah, so I think right now we are more stuck on the earlier side of blameless postmortem culture. I think part of that is, you know, we as a tech industry, we need some improvement in how we think about like systems. Like it's not like technical systems are not completely separated from, you know, social systems or organizational systems, right? They're like they are very interdependent. It's like what socio-technical is all about. So I think there's like a missing sort of skill set, I guess, amongst the industry. Like not too many people think in that way because that's how it has been historically. So I think we're building that up as a muscle right now. So I think we're just feeling the growing pains of that. So I suspect that, you know, this will continue to be a thing for a long time. But one of the things that also spoke to me was I think one way that we are seeing this shift, though, is, you know, I think in the earlier days of like SRE, right, there was always this emphasis on like finding the root cause, right? And now we're more shifting towards a framework where we're like, there's multiple root causes, right? And this is sort of an attribute of the fact that like it's a socio-technical problem, not just a technical problem. So I think that is at least one indicator that like we're improving the way we talk about this. But I still think like that sort of ability to find those root causes is where we still need some maturity. And I think a lot of that also has to do with like it's uncomfortable, especially because one of the things I like to say is like blameless postmortem culture. It's like definitely not applicable to leadership, actually. I know some people might find that controversial, but I do think like in that case, right, like of course you have to do it respectfully and like communicating effectively is important, right? But I think like it should be normal to own up to like where you messed up. Right? Like those are the uncomfortable conversations that need to happen. I'm very okay saying, yeah, I mean, I went totally wrong with that. And unfortunately, it does make you vulnerable. Like I'll be honest, I've been that person who's trying to change the culture by, leading by example and admitting where I went wrong. And it's been used against me, that's for sure. But I have to hold that intention with well, one, how do I sleep at night? And two, like what is my work? Like there's my job, but like what is my work, which is ultimately, I think, to like, make this world a better place. And hopefully, I think a lot of people want the same thing. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that came to mind. Might not have answered the question fully, but feel free to riff off of that.
That was great. Thank you, Abby.
Yeah, I think you answered it fully, and I'm going to go in a really narrow section to add to one of the points you made, which is you were talking about the evolution of postmortems and blameless postmortems in the SRE space. And I think there's another evolution there that I've witnessed in my experiences that I think is important, which is blameless does not mean not identifying that it was human error. It's identifying what in the system allowed human error to occur. And so I think you can take responsibility for human error having occurred. And to your point, Sarah, I think you said this now a couple of times, and I love it, which is it's not just about acknowledging, yeah, I had a human error, but why was I able to get that far? Why was I able to have that level of impact? And especially at a high level, often broad impact. Where were my checks and balances? Where were my feedback loops? Where could I build a system that can stop this from having that level of impact in the future? So I think when you first start with blameless postmortems, you kind of start with like the 5 whys to get to your root cause. And I think we're all evolving to learn that there's more effective ways to look at that socio-technical system that Leslie so nicely laid out and figure out the number of causes that have set up that context in that situation, and acknowledging that when it is to do with the social side of things, the human side, that still is a system that can be improved and built around.
Yeah, that's a terrific way to put that. We have a couple more points for discussion among us, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And we've already got a few good questions in there, so I encourage all the attendees to think about questions you want to add in, because we definitely are going to have time for those at the end. So I want to talk a little bit about environments. Accountability is often lost in environments where things are changing quickly, which is pretty much all startups. And I'm wondering how you make time for it. Nick, can you start us off?
Yeah, so yeah, I've had a history in here with fellow and so on, and you're right. In a small startups, you're trying to bake in accountability. You're trying to set objectives, and a week in, and a founder sits on your desk, and an engineer's desk that changes what they're doing, and somebody else comes in with a customer issue 2 days later. I think the way that I've seen successfully getting around it is not to rest on the laurel that everything's going to change and we're all going to jump on and get things across the line. It's actually doing more one-to-ones, regular status alignment and objective setting, doing it even more, but and making it really snappy. So getting together, making sure everybody knows where they're going. So what always happens with startups, well, my experience is you'll always get individuals spinning off on their own and actually getting us across the line while it's leaving lots of people behind. And for me, yeah, things can move quickly, and all you're saying is do the things that you need to do to keep driving that accountability. Do it more regularly and short. And the one thing I'd say about startups, so where accountability is, you've got just a bucket load of ownership in a startup, people work in a startup with their stock and so on, they so want the company to be effective. The ownership is strongest you'll ever get it. So not just having to sort of go at the startups, but it's like, can you take that and bottle it and use it to grow your business when you're sort of go 300, 400 people? And to me, it's trying to take some of the things that you feel in that ownership in small startups and actually try to break your organization into mini startups that can go and take that, plus give in some of the sort of autonomy that you can give a team when they get a wee bit bigger to drive success. So for me, it's sort of a multitude of answers in there. One is like a startup, the ownership, you can't buy it. But as I say, just need to do things more often on accountability. You just need to move quickly with how change is happening with those one-to-ones, and objective sentences is one of the things I'd call it.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting that you're pointing about, of course, like ownership is highest when there's literal ownership in the company. Um, and it's also interesting when you're at a smaller company, any individual who's not aligned to the goals, which are probably changing pretty rapidly, could have a pretty big impact. Like they're not contributing in something where they're really needed. They're building something that winds up needing to be supported and is drawing away from things that might actually turn out to be profitable. There's lots of failure modes if people aren't aligned, which is slightly less true when you're like hundreds or thousands of people. If a couple of people are off astray, it doesn't have nearly as big an impact typically. And so part of what that tells us is in smaller organizations where you're trying to move quickly, it's really incumbent on leaders to communicate very clearly when things are changing and why. And that's both in like the all hands situations and, as you said, Nick, in one-on-one. So in smaller group team settings. So people really have a strong understanding because things are going to be changing fast and you'll need to communicate about it quite a bit. Abby.
Yeah, I'm in this world. I'm in a seed level startup now. I was just in a startup before this as well. And I think that point of communicating where the change of directions happen is super key. And part of that is prioritization. So not only that direction is changing, but that it is actively important that you drop where you are, that it's great the work we've put in somewhere, but that is not where we are now. We're switching directions is an important part of that messaging if that's what's important. I think that, accountability is understanding that there's only so many things you can do in a day. And especially as I've never been on a team, no matter the size of the organization, that's had too little to do, to be fair. But particularly to startup, I think there's just always something else for you to do. And having true prioritization around what you care about as an organization in your principles as much as the pieces of work you're doing helps to drive that. So I'd say that. And then the second thing, just quickly, I'd say is praising what you want to see. So I think one thing that you see a lot in that firefighter culture and that everyone has stock, pull it over the line, let's go, be a part owner kind of world is people get praised for that. People get praised for putting in overtime. People get praised for going off and doing their thing. That is going to create more of that. Anything you praise is going to get more. So not only should that possibly be told, like outwardly made to acknowledge that was not our intention as a company, but at least don't praise it. At least praise the people and the behaviors that you want to see over again. So I think those are two things that are really important at that scale.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good point. And like the most common failure mode is phrasing the things that you actually don't want to see because somebody did something heroic that was needed, but isn't really the culture you want to create. I want to talk about one more point before we move to the good questions that are starting to come in here. In a company without a strong culture of accountability from the top, how can individual teammates foster it? Lizzie, I'm going to ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of strategies for this, right? I think it also depends on the role of that person in that team and also the wider company. Like I, at my job, have a local team that I'm responsible for, but because I'm a staff engineer, I'm also responsible for thinking at our like our wider organizational level, like the engineering department level, arguably even beyond that. So I think it also depends on that, like I think for me, when I was younger and like in a less senior role, like the sort of strategies I had access to were far more limited, right? That's why I think it's particularly important for leaders to sort of take on this work. So, as a younger, more junior engineer, right, a lot of it is about making sure or finding the ways in which you can communicate like feedback and your experiences. And if you can't find that, take that as information for like whether you should stay there. Like if you're in an environment where you're not being listened to, and I know it's hard to say that now because to answer someone's question about like what's going on in tech, there's lots of layoffs, right? So I think, that's part of the struggle with, I think, like wanting to sort of push back and push for change in a company is people are scared that they're going to lose their jobs, because layoffs, we don't know how things are chosen. We assume the worst. We assume that they'll get rid of the low performers, the people who make noise and are challenging things, because those things do happen. So I think those are like that's a complicated part when you're a more junior person, is you do have less power to change things, but you still have a voice, and I think that's like what's important. As you get more senior, right? Like I think there's sort of the bottom up and like versus top and organizational, right? So for me, it's like I sort of view myself as like often being a lot of like doing a lot of translation work. Like it's very weird to like have to work with like my CTO, but then also work with like a mid-level or whatnot engineer, right? So I have access to both those perspectives, but they don't have access to each other's perspectives, right? And so I think a lot of my role, especially as someone who's like an underrepresented person in tech, right, is like I feel like I have to be, or I should be, that translator, that enabler of like communication between folks who don't normally have access to one another. So that's one thing that's super important to me. I try to, when mid-level or entry-level, just younger engineers want to provide feedback but feel scared to, I try to take on that burden for them. And with their consent and whatnot, or having like aggregate feedback, or making sure to be careful about their identity and whatnot, of course, too, and safety. But that's sort of one of the ways that I also do it. And so that top down, when I think about the top down versus bottom up, right? I think of bottom up, you have to also often do it by leading by example. And then top down, right? I think it's about having a lot of hard conversations. Like I'm very willing to have hard conversations. If my CTO was watching this, he'd be like, yeah, you do. Right. But also that's why we like respect each other a lot, is because we're both willing to have those conversations. And we have both, I think, seen like at least some fruits of that labor. So those are some of my thoughts around there.
Right, thank you for that. I think some of the Q&A questions here are also going to get into some detail on this. So let's dive into those. And I want to mention we're running a little over time here. Of course, we're recording so people can watch afterward if we're running past your ability to stay. We'll also, any questions that we can't get to in the time, if there are any, we'll put them in the Effective Teams channel in Slack and look at them asynchronously. So a question here from Ines Matos. Any tips to make developers feel more accountable for the whole task or mission of the team and not just looking at their own single task? So, for example, if somebody goes on vacation and there wasn't any handover beforehand, the task stays on the board, and I'm assuming that's like a Kanban board or something, a Jira type board, without moving, because nobody is proactively taking ownership over it during the vacation period of time. How do we promote a culture where the team members would feel accountable for that? Despite what's on the face of the board, this person, this ticket is assigned to them. How do we make sure that things move beyond that? Abby, I see you nodding, so I'm going to call you. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I saw Nick on mute, but I'll say quickly, I think part of it is literally processes you can put into place. So first of all, whether or not that person should have had responsibility of doing a handover, or whether the team should have the responsibility of picking something up that, has been left due to vacation, are two different behaviors. Not right, not wrong. Those are two different behaviors that you might want to foster in your team. I personally like to work under the behavior of an individual is in charge of that value being delivered. And so if I'm going on vacation and that value has not been delivered, it's my job to make sure that the team feels informed and empowered to do the work, if I believe that my duration of vacation is going to have a problem there, right? I might look at it and go, look, I'm having a long weekend. This is a low priority ticket. The cost of bringing someone else onto this isn't worth the cognitive load. I'm going to choose to not hand that over. And that's me taking accountability and making a decision, a risk assessment on that. So one of the things when I was saying process is about how you manage the columns. And as you said, I'm assuming a Kanban board of some sort. One of my least favorite things is when there's some sort of an in review column or a testing column that you can shove something into and move on, because somebody on your team is supposed to come look at your PR. Not your PR to review anymore. Someone else has to come review it. I always like to keep ownership of things through to merge and to validation in production or wherever, however far you allow your teams to go, with the owner of the developer that was writing the code or developers that were writing the code. If you need a PR review, it's up to you to make that PR reviewable and to find the time and energy to walk someone through it if that's what's needed because of the complexity of the change or the responsibility team. So yeah, how you set up your board and how you set up ownership of tickets, I think, can have a really big difference on the visibility of ownership and the expectation set for the developers.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love that point about you're responsible for the value regardless of the task at any given stage. Nick had unmuted before. Leslie's unmuted here. We have a lot to say about this. I want to let Nick jump in, and then we also have a bunch of other questions.
I'll be very quick as well. Really, just to add to what Abby says, I think Abby, you're trying to drive that sort of ownership and accountability to the actual board. And one of the things you can try is rotating people to actually step through the board weekly. So who owns the board kind of for each week, and it's to get that mindset that everybody owns the board. So if there's something stuck in the middle, you have to call it out. And getting someone to actually own the review and drive that review and rotating it really does bring sort of ownership, and that sort of hopefully unblock things like that happening.
Leslie.
Should I go? Okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to walk through a few like concrete examples of how I think about it, which so the SRE in me is always like, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Which people in my life might find annoying sometimes. But so, when I hear the question about like, the vacation and whatnot, I also think people's lives just like shit happens essentially, right? Like you might become sick all of a sudden. Someone might have to go on leave for an extended time. Like things happen. And so I think a lot about like preparing for that position. And one thing as a value for myself, like is especially when I'm in a leadership position is like, how do I make sure that I'm not like a point of failure? Like if there's like the bus factor, which is a really dark way of referring to it, but like if I suddenly have to like disappear, or I don't know, someone rage quits or something, like what would that aftermath look like? Right. Like there's, like if there's often like there will be sort of the narrative that like, oh my gosh, if X person left, we'd be like, it'd be so bad. And like that is a sign of organizational failure, right? We should not be so dependent on someone that like there's a fear of like their absence. So one thing I more concretely do is so we have chaos engineering or chaos testing in for code and whatnot. My favorite chaos testing for organizational issues is me deciding last minute, I'm going to go on vacation. And like, let's see how the team does. And if it does well, then I'm doing my job well. If I'm not, I have some work ahead of me. And so, I think one of my proudest moments as a leader was when I switched teams and I was a little worried, like, oh, I hope I set them up for success, da, 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 da. And the team did great without me. And they were like, one of them was like, yeah, but I think that's because like you laid a lot of good foundation. I was like, all right, I can quit tech now. I'm good. So that's like one of the strategies that I really like to use is just like testing out to see what will lead to the improvement and make sure that we're more proactive. And then also another thing is like with on-call shifts, I'm very much of the belief that there shouldn't be project work being done by on-call engineers. So sometimes they'll just be the de facto like default person to like review PRs and whatnot. So that way it's way more clear like who's responsible for it at any given moment.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting too, like in smaller orgs, you often don't have any kind of redundancy. There isn't if the bus factor is one for many things, sometimes it's a half, and you don't have the luxury of having people who are on call not doing other things. So that does, one of the implications of that is, again, in smaller organizations, more communication is important. And I think to Nick's point about rotating roles in teams and having everybody understand the kinds of communication that you need is can be critical and particularly useful in smaller teams. All right, we've got more questions coming in. So I think what we'll do is try to get to probably 2 more and then do the rest of these asynchronously. But that's part of the idea, is to do some of this asynchronously. So I encourage people to keep asking. So how do you foster an accountability culture where people could flag problems on a team but don't? For example, a back-end engineer noticed an issue on a front-end problem, and because they were stressed, they weren't thinking proactively, they didn't flag it. And it could also be that they were thinking, this isn't my job. How do you get a team to think in terms of this is the team's job and not just an individual's job? And by the way, the back-end engineer in this case might have been somebody who's like actually typically very like takes a lot of responsibility for their work, but then is letting things slip on the team.
I think one of the
Yeah.
things that's oh, sorry. I'll say one of the things I think is an issue here is if there isn't a culture of being able to call attention to things without people feeling attacked. So just as much as we talked a lot about individuals being able to be vulnerable and step up, one of the problems here is where if you have if you were to raise as a backend engineer a bug on the front end, is that viewed as kind of putting a target on someone else's back? So I think that it's really important that we acknowledge the social constructs in the organization. Sometimes when we talk about what can individuals do to foster accountability, we have to acknowledge that the scope, the safety around them isn't there, and that possibly they can only foster that within their domain, and possibly isn't there to go across domains. Then you need to tackle that from a higher level. Why is it that we have this sort of fiefdom life? And that's where executives and managers and above need to get involved and change that.
That's excellent. Nick, I'm going to give you the final word here. We are actually like enough over time that this is our in fact our last question. We'll take the rest asynchronously. So please bring us home with the deep insight.
No, so I want to actually take a bias. There's another question on this I see down there as well, is if you have a mindset in a team of delivering frequently, if you've got a mindset of, you've got feature flags and you're releasing content to a customer every week, you won't have the ability to actually sit and have gaps between back end and front end. You won't, that culture goes away because you're actually delivering pieces to a customer very regularly. And with that mindset, you will move faster, but also the mindset of he, she, them, whoever it is in the team that has left something undone, the whole team is under pain each week if in that delivery it doesn't deliver what the customers expect. And so I think the big thing is get a culture of delivery, get a culture that a delivery is a full vertical slice. And with things like feature flags, the customer gets to feel and touch things very regularly. So, but they want to see the whole thing. You can't afford to do pieces, and the team, you will see that change in culture in the team.
All right. Amen. Excellent insights. Thank you all so much. It's such a rich topic. Clearly, we could keep going for a long time, and we will take some of this async into the Effective Teams channel on the Slack. Thank you to our attendees and our panelists. We hope to see you again in the future.